So I guess we are just never going to be able to talk about Avengers comics without there being some behind-the-scenes drama, are we? Oh well. Be sure to subscribe to our channel for more videos on comics, new and old. Now it's time for our round 7 of grading the Avengers. With Roger Stern having been forcibly removed from Avengers history, the writing job shifted to Walt Simonson after a brief stint by Ralph Macchio. Not that one. A strange thing about this is that such a move could naturally induce a pretty substantial change in the series. Obviously, if editor Mark Gruenwald wasn't happy with the Avengers series as it existed, getting a new writer would be a good way to change things. And yet our roster remains largely the same as before, even with the general tone and lax nature of the series remaining more or less intact. I'm not sure if those early books were already in production or if they felt the need to slowly introduce Simonson's own team, but either way, half of his run is very similar to Roger Stern's. There was conflict from the beginning. In the years to come, Walt has since described the scripts that he'd spent months working on for the Avengers series being eviscerated by people like Gruenwald and other superiors within the company. It occasionally shows in the writing itself, with Simonson's first arc feeling particularly dry, especially compared to the Stern comics from before. Things started to feel a little unfocused at times. Unfortunately, you can see a lot of quality there too, but there are forces clearly holding it back, and I don't think that has a lot to do with Walt Simonson, who's a talented writer with a long history of writing successful comic books. It in fact shows at times. Introduced on the team in the late Stern days, I really liked Doctor Druid as an Avenger. I've talked before about how progressive the Avengers felt around this time, and honestly, a slightly overweight guy who's a little older feels like an absolute rarity in the world of superheroes. And I'm not saying that as someone looking back on something in the late 80s, I'm saying that as someone in the 2020, talking about the present day. Dr. Druid, though he was never really warmly regarded as a character throughout critic history, in the Avengers consistently feels like a welcome addition to the team and a character utterly unique to the team's history and, to be honest, most superheroes. Marvel, DC, and even their larger film studio parent companies love to pat themselves on the back over diversity and progressive stuff, but no matter how you cut it across the entire history of these companies, we really haven't seen superheroes that look like this before. In spite of all the conflict going on behind the scenes and a somewhat dry first arc, there's a lot of fun potential in Walt Simonson's era that never really gets fully realized. He works amazingly well with John Buscema. Though their time on the Avengers was short and their scripts apparently gutted to some extent, the two pull off some very memorable and delightful moments. There's a great story with a legion of alternate Kang the Conquerors all scheming for power, that opens with a full-out robot dinosaur rampage, for crying out loud. It's great. Walt even created a story using some of his characters created elsewhere named Nanny and Orphan Maker, two current stars of the ongoing series in the present day Hellions, which was just fun for me to see. Another issue has Jarvis straight up battling a giant robot. In both of those stories, Walt also introduced to the Avengers series a Captain America that had been redesigned from that role, and was at the time just calling himself the Captain. Yet his stories remain fun and character-focused and don't feel gimmicky around this new costume for Steve Rogers. The Captain is also featured heavily in the sole annual Walt wrote for this series, a fun book that showed he was more than capable of having former Avengers show up for stories that could be written effectively. That annual features the likes of Avengers from all corners of the team's history, including Beast, the Hulk, and Jocasta, a character whose name I have probably mispronounced, because I haven't talked about her yet and forgot to research it before recording this, but is a fun part of Avengers history and their consistent open-mindedness when it comes to synthetic life, something I've talked about already when it comes to Vision and his relationship with Scarlet Witch. That annual is sort of a big celebratory thing that absolutely would have been the excellent sort of story for the big issue Walt Simonson also wrote, number 300. But instead of it being some sort of big celebration, issue number 300 is the second part of the tie-in to the event Inferno, a move that I can't help but suspect Marvel was responsible for. I did say that Roger Stern's era marked the beginning of tie-ins, and already it's starting to escalate, and the Avengers found themselves not only barreling towards the modern age of crossover events and tie-ins, often interrupting the series to its own detriment, but also it maintained their bizarre tradition of underwhelming, if not bad, 100-issue anniversary specials. It's a pretty disappointing end to Walt Simonson's run, but given all the conflict going on behind the scenes, I will say this. I don't put a lot of this era's fault on him. Like David Michelinie, Walt Simonson would return as a guest writer for the Avengers in the future and would do a good job, indicating to me that both writers and the problems they suffered with during their main run with the Avengers were in many ways editorial. And these larger problems that affect the Avengers series and a lot of other Marvel history, largely as the result of a terrible corporate culture, extend far beyond Jim Shooter, who at this point no longer had that sort of power within the company. In spite of it all, the stories written around this time have a lot of focus on the characters they feature, which serves them well. Walt is a good writer in this respect, had a clear vision for the Avengers even if he didn't get a chance to actually explore it, and always left me wishing he had a chance to do more with the team. Like David Michelinie, I leave this era of Avengers wondering, more than anything else, about what could have been. Whatever was intended for this era of Avengers was not fully realized here, and we're left with a run of comics that feel incomplete, yet still have something to offer. 7 rounds in, and we're finding ourselves hitting our very first B grade of any kind, which is surprising because there's a lot more of it coming. But in this grading scheme I've created exclusively for Avengers comics, it should be noted, a B- indicates comics just above average. Not quite in the range of being one of my favorites, but not nearly in terrible land either. This run of Avengers comics is strong and has a lot of solid moments, yet there are problems, including the first story arc being quite long and unnecessarily drawn out, while issue number 300 is disappointing, as I said. Simonson's run is entertaining more than anything else though, hence the B grade. But I don't love that it distances itself heavily from the traditions up until then of relatively shorter Avengers stories, with the majority of stories up until now only being 1 or 2 issues long. Stern started the trend of having longer stories, but his time with the Avengers was long and could afford these long diversions into a random tale because he had a lot of single issues to back that up. Walt's is the shortest run a writer had with the Avengers up until this point. It has some outstanding stuff when it comes to character work, but it falls a little short in fully exploring some of these ideas because in part it takes too long to really get into things where writers like Roger Stern, Stan Lee, and Roy Thomas could have accomplished and did accomplish a lot more in 10 issues than Walt Simonson ever did. I do wish he had more time with this run just the same, because as it stands it really only feels half realized. By the time he was done with the series, he only really just got what was clearly going to be his team rolling. And there is quite a bit of value to that team, and it does seem to have some potential. Overall, it does stick out a great deal compared to some of the other lesser runs in Avengers history. The whole era feels like it robustly exists within the Marvel Universe, for example, and it is always fun to have cool characters we don't often get to see enjoy some real time in the spotlight. Even the Inferno tie-in has the fun of Mr. Fantastic and the Invisible Woman joining the Avengers, as part of what was clearly going to be a new team consisting of them, the Captain, Thor, and the first Eternal to join the team, Gilgamesh. The new team seems cool, but we never really got to see them in action, though a version of them would basically exist as we go into the next age of Avengers. Still, some of my confusion in all this has to stem from the lack of communication at the time. It makes no sense to me that Marvel's editors would fire Roger Stern and then replace him with a writer who decided to basically just keep doing the same kind of stories, which was character-focused, goofy stories, and an offbeat team that really wasn't consisting of the most popular heroes at the time, but rather what worked best for the team. So either they should never have hired Simonson to begin with, if that's what he was going to do. They should have insisted from the beginning that he made sure things were more significantly different from the Roger Stern days, since that's why they fired Roger Stern. Or they should have compromised and not forced Simonson to make changes to scripts that had already been made. It's just bad management to have an incoming employee that you don't effectively communicate the changes that you want to the series Or they did communicate those changes to Walt Simonson and he just deliberately ignored them. We don't actually know, and there are two sides to every story, but whatever the case, it affects the final product when we look at these comics in a negative way. Part of the issue might have just been bloat. At this point, there was both an East and West Coast Avengers team also being published at the time, and maybe people at Marvel felt that sudden changes to the roster of these teams couldn't just arbitrarily be done. Some comics were made or right in the middle of production, and that might explain why it feels like it takes Walt Simonson's entire run just to get the team he wanted going. But that's on Marvel. They created this system, they created those rules, and made all those Avengers teams and weren't willing to budge on it. And either way, this is what we're left with. Books have been written on this sort of comic history, and that's largely where I'm drawing this information from, but they mostly just go by the words and recollections of Walt Simonson on the matter, years after the fact. Memory can be tricky and biased, even if someone didn't intend to distort the issue. And sometimes people very much do want to tell things that portray them in a favorable light. This feels especially true for someone like Walt Simonson, whose time with the Avengers represents a very small part of a long and storied career. How well do you remember a job that didn't work out so well 20 years ago, and how confident are you that you have the ability to present all the relevant facts and correctly remember all the relevant information if you were asked about it by someone today? So I'm not really calling him out when I say that his recollections might not be accurate. He has no means of verifying that information. We're all biased actors in this story. And I say that not to cast doubt on the official accounts of these events, just to remind everyone we should take stuff like this with a grain of salt. And that absolutely applies when we talk about the drama surrounding people like Roger Stern or Jim Shooter that has been discussed before already. Generally, this is why I prefer to grade and review what's actually in the comic itself. Unfortunately, when it comes to this particular era, I feel that the behind-the-scenes conflict is pretty present within the books, to the extent that it's the only way I can really make sense of it and put it into context. It's right there, and in and of itself, that's not a great sign. That sort of thing is what really takes me out of these Avengers comics. So, dissatisfied with everything we've just talked about, the second major Avengers writer in a row left the series under less than desirable circumstances. I'm not entirely sure whether Simonson was fired or quit. I don't really think it matters. But whatever the case, both parties went their separate ways, and both seem to have felt it would be for the best. One would think this would lead to some sort of contrition or reaction on Marvel's part, perhaps some sort of internal mandate to not let this happen again to one of Marvel's flagship series. Ralph Macchio, not that one, returned to the series to fill in for a time and explore the team Walt Simonson had just created, while a new writer would have to be found. And while it's clear this one was told at the outset that changes would be made, or he would need to get lost, this was far from the end of Avengers drama. Because, out of all the people Marvel picked, they chose John Byrne. And for those of you that don't know, or don't expect drama out of this guy, well, I'll explain it all next time, here on Grading the Avengers.